In a forgotten corner of rural Vermont, a struggling librarian named Elena Rodriguez made what everyone called the worst financial decision of her life, buying a crumbling 100-year-old library that hadn't seen a patron in over 2 decades. The townspeople whispered she'd lost her mind, especially when she spent her life savings on a building most considered an eyesore destined for demolition.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
But hidden within those dusty, forgotten shelves lay a secret that would transform her from the town's cautionary tale into living proof that sometimes the most worthless places hold the most priceless treasures. What began as a desperate attempt to save her career became an extraordinary journey of discovery, determination, and one woman's fight to uncover a mystery that had been waiting over a century to be solved. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the Millbrook Public Library like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the empty reading tables that Elena Rodriguez had come to know too well. At 34, she had spent the last 8 years working as the head librarian in this small Vermont town, watching the place slowly empty as people chose screens over books, delivery over discovery. Elena sat behind the circulation desk, staring at a stack of pink termination notices that had arrived that morning. Budget cuts, they said, declining patronage. The town council had made their decision. The library would close permanently in 60 days, and Elena's position would be eliminated along with it. She pressed her palms against her tired eyes, feeling the weight of failure settling over her like a heavy blanket. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Elena had graduated with her master's in library science from Syracuse University with dreams of becoming a guardian of knowledge, a bridge between communities and the infinite wisdom contained in books. Instead, she'd become the keeper of an empty tomb. "Rough day," came a voice from behind her. Elena looked up to see Margaret Chen, the elderly woman who ran the antique shop next door. Margaret was one of the library's few remaining regular visitors, though Elena suspected she came more for companionship than for books. "Every day's been rough lately," Elena admitted, gesturing to the termination notices. 60 days, and then it's over." Margaret walked over and picked up one of the notices, scanning it with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of businesses fold in small towns. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there might be another option." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Unless you know someone willing to donate a few $100,000 to keep this place running, I'm not sure what options are left." "Well," Margaret said with a mysterious smile, "what if I told you there was another library for sale, one that comes with its own history, its own mysteries, and a price tag that might surprise you?" That's how Elena found herself driving 20 miles north the following Saturday, following Margaret's hand-drawn directions to what the older woman had called the Old Carnegie Library in Whitmore Falls. The town itself seemed frozen in time. Weathered Victorian houses lined streets that probably hadn't been repaved since the 1980s, and more than half the storefronts displayed "for rent" in their dusty windows. The library stood at the end of Main Street like a monument to forgotten dreams. Built in 1923 with funds from the Carnegie Foundation, it was a beautiful example of classical revival architecture, or at least it had been once. Now ivy crawled up its limestone walls like green fingers trying to pull the building into the earth. The copper roof had turned a magnificent verdigris, and several of the tall windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and grayed with age. A realtor's sign leaned precariously in the overgrown front yard. Historic property, serious inquiries only. Elena pulled her Honda Civic up to the curb and sat for a moment, taking in the sight. The building was larger than she had expected. 3 stories tall with a distinctive dome that crowned the central reading room. Stone lions flanked the front steps, their faces worn smoothed by decades of Vermont winters, but still maintaining a dignified bearing that suggested they were guarding something precious. Elena climbed the cracked concrete steps and peered through one of the unboarded windows. Inside, she could see towering shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, built from rich, dark wood that probably came from local forests a century ago. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the gloom, and she could make out the ghostly outlines of reading tables and chairs covered in white sheets. Quite a sight, isn't she? Elena turned to find the thin man in his 60s approaching from a blue sedan. He wore a rumpled suit and carried a briefcase that had seen better days. "You must be Elena Rodriguez," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dave Patterson, the realtor. Margaret Chen said you might be interested in taking a look." "I'm not sure interested is the right word. More like curious. What's the story with this place?" Dave pulled out a set of keys that looked like they belonged in a museum. Built in 1923, closed in 1998 when the town consolidated services with the county system. Been sitting empty ever since. The town's been trying to sell it for years, but, he gestured at the building's deteriorated condition, most people see a money pit. "And what do you see?" Elena asked. Dave smiled. "I see someone who might understand what this place could be again."
He led her up the steps and unlocked the heavy oak doors. They swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the decades, and Elena stepped into another world. The main reading room took her breath away. Despite years of neglect, the space retained an undeniable grandeur. The domed ceiling soared 40 feet above them, decorated with intricate plasterwork that depicted scenes of learning and discovery. Tall windows lined the walls, and though many were dirty or boarded up, those that remained clear cast cathedral-like beams of light across the room. The smell hit her next, that distinctive perfume of old books, aged wood, and the kind of quiet that can only accumulate over decades. It was the smell of knowledge waiting patiently to be rediscovered. "Most of the books are still here," Dave explained, leading her between the towering shelves. "When they closed, they just locked the doors and walked away. Said it would cost more to move everything than it was worth." Elena ran her fingers along the spines of countless volumes. Fiction, history, science, poetry. Entire worlds waiting in silence. Many of the books were old, some dating back to the library's founding. Others showed the wear patterns of countless readers, covers softened by eager hands, pages marked with the invisible history of every person who had ever found solace or adventure within their words. "How much?" she asked quietly. "Asking price is $85,000, Dave said. "But between you and me, the town would probably take 60 if someone showed serious interest. They're mainly hoping someone will buy it who won't just tear it down for the lot." Elena's heart sank. Even 60,000 might as well have been 60 million on her librarian's salary, especially with unemployment looming in 2 months. "I know it's a lot," Dave continued, "but think about it this way. You'd be buying not just a building, but everything in it. Thousands of books, all the original furniture, even the old card catalog system. Someone with your background could turn this into something special." They spent the next hour exploring. Dave showed her the children's section in the basement, with its low shelves and reading nook that had been designed to spark young imaginations. They climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, where the reference section housed encyclopedias, atlases, and academic journals that chronicled nearly a century of human knowledge and discovery. The third floor was the most intriguing. Originally designed as storage and office space, it contained room after room of boxes, files, and furniture that had been accumulated over the library's 75 years of operation. Dave admitted he'd never fully cataloged what was up there. "Could be anything," he said with a shrug.
Old records, donation files, maybe some rare books that were kept separate from the main collection. As they prepared to leave, Elena took one last look around the main reading room. In her mind, she could see it restored, windows clean and bright, shelves organized and full, reading tables occupied by students and researchers and dreamers. She could imagine the sound of pages turning, the whispered conversations of people discovering new ideas, the quiet energy of a place where minds came to grow. "Can I have a few days to think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Dave replied. "But I should mention there's been some interest from a development group. They're looking at tearing it down and putting in condominiums. If you're serious about preserving this place, sooner might be better than later." That night, Elena sat in her small apartment above the flower shop in Millbrook, surrounded by financial documents and calculators. She had about $30,000 in savings, money she'd been carefully accumulating for years, originally hoping to buy a small house someday. Her salary at the library was modest but steady, and she'd lived frugally, driving the same Honda for 8 years and cooking most of her meals at home. But $30,000 wasn't $60,000, and banks weren't exactly eager to loan money to unemployed librarians for 100-year-old buildings that needed extensive renovation. She called her sister Carmen in Boston, who worked in real estate development. "Elena, honey, are you having some kind of breakdown? You want to buy an abandoned library in a dying town with money you don't have. This isn't you." "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I've been too practical, too safe. Maybe it's time to take a risk on something I actually believe in." "But what's your business plan? How will you make money? What if you can't afford the upkeep?" Elena didn't have good answers to any of those questions. She only had a feeling, the same feeling she'd had as a child when she'd discovered the public library in her neighborhood, and realized that within those walls lay more adventures, more knowledge, more possibilities than she could explore in 10 lifetimes. The next morning, she made a decision that would change everything. She called Dave Patterson and asked if the seller would consider owner financing, a smaller down payment with monthly payments over time. It was a long shot, but sometimes long shots were all you had. To her surprise, the town council was willing to negotiate. They accepted $25,000 down with payments of $800 a month for 10 years. It would stretch Elena's finances to the breaking point, especially with no steady income, but it was doable. 3 weeks later, Elena Rodriguez stood on the front steps of the Whitmore Falls Carnegie Library, holding the deed in her trembling hands. The townspeople of Millbrook thought she had lost her mind. Her family questioned her judgment. Even Margaret Chen, who had started this whole adventure, wondered aloud if Elena knew what she was getting herself into. But as Elena unlocked those heavy oak doors for the first time as the owner, as she stepped into the cathedral silence of the main reading room and breathed in the perfume of a century's worth of stories waiting to be rediscovered, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt hope. Elena didn't know that within these walls lay a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the building's history. She didn't know that her careful, methodical approach to cataloging and organizing would lead her to discover something that had been hidden for over a century. And she certainly didn't know that her decision to buy this forgotten library would eventually make her the center of a treasure hunt that would capture the imagination of people around the world. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she was exactly where she belonged. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena's first night in the library was nothing like she had imagined. She had set up a small camping setup in what used to be the librarian's office. An air mattress, sleeping bag, and a battery-powered lantern that cast eerie shadows across the book-lined walls. The building creaked and settled around her with sounds she'd never noticed during her daytime visits, as if the old structure was slowly exhaling decades of held breath.
She'd moved in immediately after the closing, partly because she couldn't afford both rent on her apartment and the library payments, but mostly because she couldn't bear to leave the building empty for even one more night. Elena had always been the type to dive headfirst into projects, and this was the biggest project of her life. The first week was a reality check that nearly broke her resolve. The heating system hadn't worked in years, and October nights in Vermont were already dipping below freezing. The plumbing functioned sporadically, sometimes producing rusty water, sometimes nothing at all. The electrical system was a patchwork of updates from different decades, and Elena quickly learned which circuits would trip if she tried to run too many things at once. But the books were remarkable. As Elena began her systematic cataloging process, starting with the main fiction section, she discovered treasures that most libraries would kill for. First edition Steinbecks, original Hemingway novels from the 1920s, signed copies of works by Robert Frost, who had lived just 2 hours south. The previous librarians had clearly known their business and had acquired some genuine literary gems over the decades. Elena established a routine. She woke each morning as the sun crested the hills surrounding Whitmore Falls, made coffee on a camping stove she'd set up in the break room, and spent her days methodically working through section after section. She had inherited thousands of books, and she was determined to know every single one of them. The townspeople began to notice her presence. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, who lived in the Victorian house across the street, started bringing Elena casseroles and thermoses of hot soup. She was a retired school teacher who remembered when the library had been the beating heart of the community. "You know," Dorothy said one afternoon, setting down a container of homemade chili, "my grandmother used to tell stories about this place. Said there were secrets hidden in these walls that went back to the very beginning." Elena looked up from the psychology textbooks she was cataloging. "What kind of secrets?" Dorothy smiled mysteriously. "Oh, you know how old people talk, probably nothing more than gossip and wishful thinking. But Grandma always claimed that old Mr. Carnegie didn't just fund the building. He had some special reason for choosing Whitmore Falls. Said there was something here he wanted protected." "Andrew Carnegie funded over 2,500 libraries," Elena replied practically. "I don't think Whitmore Falls was particularly special to him." "Maybe not," Dorothy said with a shrug. "But Grandma swore that Jeremiah Morrison, he was the first head librarian, came here with more than just books. Said he brought something valuable that needed hiding." Elena filed the conversation away as small-town folklore, but it planted a seed of curiosity that would grow stronger with each passing day. Her biggest challenge wasn't the building's physical problems or the endless cataloging work. It was money. Elena's savings were dwindling faster than she had anticipated. The monthly payment to the town was manageable, but the costs of basic utilities, repairs, and food were adding up quickly. She'd applied for dozens of jobs, both in-person and remote, but opportunities for librarians in rural Vermont were virtually non-existent. That's when she met Thomas Bradford, a retired professor from Dartmouth who had heard about her project through Margaret Chen. Thomas had spent 40 years teaching American history and had a particular interest in the Carnegie Library system. He drove up from Hanover on a drizzly Thursday morning, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the kind of thick wool sweater that professors seemed to favor. "I understand you're the brave soul who bought this place," he said, extending a hand. "Thomas Bradford. I've been studying Carnegie libraries for most of my career, and I'd love to take a look around if you don't mind." Elena was happy for the company. She'd been working alone for 2 weeks, and conversation with another book lover was exactly what she needed. Thomas proved to be a wealth of knowledge about the Carnegie Foundation's library program and the architectural details that made each building unique. "This is exceptional," he said, as they stood in the main reading room. "The preservation level is remarkable. Most Carnegie libraries have been heavily modified over the decades, but this looks almost exactly as it would have in 1923.
They spent hours talking about the building's history. Thomas explained how Andrew Carnegie had believed that libraries were the most democratic of institutions, places where anyone, regardless of background or wealth, could access the sum of human knowledge. The Carnegie Foundation had funded 1,679 libraries in the United States alone, each one built to specific architectural standards that emphasized beauty, functionality, and permanence. "But what interests me most," Thomas said as they climbed to the second floor, "is the timing of this particular library." 1923 was near the end of Carnegie's library program. Most of the grants had been distributed by 1917. For a small town like Whitmore Falls to receive funding so late in the program suggests there was something special about the request. "Like what?" Elena asked. "That's what I'd love to help you find out." Carnegie Foundation records show that the grant for this library was personally approved by Carnegie himself just 2 years before his death. But the application files are missing from the Foundation archives. Very unusual. Thomas offered to help Elena research the library's history in exchange for access to the building's original records and documents. It was exactly the kind of partnership Elena needed. Someone with research expertise and academic connections who could help uncover the story of her unusual inheritance. They started in the most logical place, the third-floor storage rooms. Elena had only briefly explored this area during her initial tour with Dave Patterson, but now she and Thomas began a systematic examination of decades' worth of accumulated materials. The first room contained mostly administrative records, budget documents, board meeting minutes, staff schedules. Useful for understanding how the library had operated over the years, but not particularly exciting. The second room was more promising. Here they found donation records, correspondence with patrons, and detailed inventories of special collections that had been added to the library over time. It was in the third storage room that they made their first real discovery. Hidden behind a stack of outdated encyclopedias, Elena found a small wooden filing cabinet that had been pushed against the back wall and apparently forgotten. The cabinet was locked, but the wood was old and warped, and Thomas managed to pry it open with a letter opener. Inside were files that predated the library's official opening. Correspondence between Jeremiah Morrison, the first head librarian, and various officials from the Carnegie Foundation. But more intriguingly, there were letters between Morrison and Andrew Carnegie himself, personal correspondence that revealed a relationship that went beyond the typical grant application process. "Listen to this," Elena said, reading from a letter dated March 15, 1922. "My dear Jeremiah, I am pleased to confirm that the Whitmore Falls project will proceed as discussed. The Foundation will provide the standard architectural plans and funding, but I trust you understand that the true purpose of this endeavor extends beyond the usual mission of public education. The collection you have described will find safe harbor in the location we discussed, and future generations will thank us for our foresight. As we agreed, the fewer people who know the complete story, the better. Your discretion in this matter has been exemplary." Elena and Thomas looked at each other in amazement. This doesn't sound like a standard library grant. It sounds like Carnegie was funding this place specifically to hide something. They continued reading. Another letter, this one from Morrison to Carnegie, dated June 8, 1922. "Sir, the construction is proceeding on schedule, and I have confirmed that the special chamber will be completed according to your specifications. The builder, Mr. Henley, believes he is simply installing additional storage space and has asked no questions. I have personally overseen the placement of the collection, and I can assure you that it will remain secure until such time as it is meant to be found. Per your instructions, I will leave appropriate guidance for my successors, though in a form that will require considerable dedication to uncover." "A special chamber?" Elena whispered. "There's a hidden room somewhere in this building?" Thomas was practically vibrating with excitement. "And according to this letter, Morrison left clues for future librarians to find it. Elena, you may have stumbled onto one of the most significant historical discoveries of the decade." They spent the rest of the day combing through the remaining files, finding fragments of the story, but nothing that clearly explained what had been hidden or where. The correspondence suggested that Carnegie and Morrison had been friends, possibly from before the library project. There were references to the collection and the items, but no specific descriptions. One letter fragment, badly water damaged and missing its beginning and end, contained the most tantalizing clue. The map itself is, of course, the key to everything. I have taken your advice and placed it where only a true lover of books would think to look. The casual observer will see only what they expect to see, but someone with genuine curiosity and proper respect for the written word will recognize. The rest of the page was illegible. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay on her air mattress, staring up at the ceiling of the office, her mind racing with possibilities. Somewhere in this building, hidden for over a century, was something valuable enough that Andrew Carnegie personally funded an entire library to protect it. And according to the letters, the first librarian had left clues that would lead the right person to discover it. Elena had always been methodical, logical, practical, but lying there in the dark, surrounded by the whispered presence of thousands of books and the weight of a century-old mystery, she felt something she'd never experienced before, the thrill of being part of something larger than herself.
She had bought this library to save her career and preserve a piece of history. Now it seems she might have inherited the adventure of a lifetime. Tomorrow she would begin looking for Morrison's clues in earnest, but tonight she allowed herself to dream about what kinds of treasures might be waiting in a hidden chamber built by one of America's most famous philanthropists and protected by a librarian who understood that some knowledge was worth safeguarding for future generations. The old building creaked and settled around her, and for the first time since she'd moved in, the sounds didn't seem lonely. They seemed like whispers of encouragement from everyone who had ever believed that within these walls lay something extraordinary, just waiting for the right person to find it. The next 3 weeks transformed Elena from a careful librarian into an obsessed detective. Armed with the fragments from Morrison's correspondence, she and Thomas developed a systematic approach to searching for the hidden clues that would lead them to Carnegie's secret chamber. Thomas had taken a leave of absence from his consulting work at Dartmouth, claiming he needed to pursue urgent historical research. He arrived each morning at sunrise with coffee and fresh notebooks, ready to tackle another section of the building. Elena had never had a research partner before, and she was amazed at how much faster the work went with someone who shared her methodical approach and growing excitement. They started with the assumption that Morrison's clues would be hidden in plain sight, disguised as normal library features that would only reveal their true meaning to someone who knew what to look for. This meant examining every single book, shelf marker, card catalog entry, and piece of furniture for anything unusual or out of place. The main reading room yielded their first real breakthrough. Thomas was examining the elaborate plasterwork on the dome ceiling when he noticed something odd about one of the decorative panels. While most depicted classical scenes of learning, scholars reading scrolls, teachers instructing students, one panel showed a figure that seemed different from the others. "Elena, look at this," he called, standing on a ladder they'd borrowed from Dorothy Walsh. "This figure here, he's not reading or teaching like the others. He's hiding something behind a book." Elena climbed up beside him and squinted at the intricate plaster relief. Thomas was right. The figure was clearly placing an object behind a row of books on a shelf, and his expression was secretive, almost conspiratorial. More importantly, the books on the shelf in the relief had titles that were actually readable, unlike the generic volumes depicted in the other panels. "Can you make out what those titles say?" Elena asked, pulling out her phone to take photos. Thomas adjusted his glasses and studied the tiny lettering. "The first one looks like Treasure Island, then Robinson Crusoe, The Count of Monte Cristo, and I think that last one is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer." Elena felt her pulse quicken. Adventure stories. Books about treasure hunting and hidden secrets. That can't be a coincidence. They spent the rest of the day locating the actual copies of those books in the library's collection. The Treasure Island was a beautiful 1920 edition with gilt lettering and detailed illustrations. Robinson Crusoe was older, possibly from the library's original 1923 collection. The Count of Monte Cristo was a 2-volume set bound in rich burgundy leather, and Tom Sawyer was a first edition that belonged in the rare books collection. But despite careful examination, none of the books revealed anything unusual. No hidden compartments, no marginalia, no loose pages or inserted documents. Elena and Thomas spent hours going through each volume page by page, looking for any kind of marking or clue that Morrison might have left. It was Thomas who finally had the breakthrough, and it came from thinking like a librarian rather than a treasure hunter. "We're approaching this wrong," he said during their lunch break on Friday. Morrison wasn't hiding clues in the books themselves. He was using the library's organization system, the Dewey Decimal System. Elena looked up from her sandwich. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Morrison was a librarian. His entire professional life revolved around categorizing and organizing information. If he wanted to leave clues that only another librarian would understand, he'd use the tools of the profession." Thomas pulled out his notebook and started writing down the call numbers for the 4 books from the ceiling panel. Treasure Island is filed under 813.4, Robinson Crusoe under 823.5, The Count of Monte Cristo under 843.7, and Tom Sawyer under 813.4 as well. Elena stared at the numbers, trying to see the pattern. 2 813.4s, 1 823.5, 1 843.7. I don't see. That's because we need to think about what those numbers represent in sequence, Thomas said excitedly. What if Morrison arranged them to spell out coordinates, or dates, or some other kind of numerical code? They spent the afternoon testing different theories. The numbers didn't seem to correspond to any obvious coordinates for locations in Whittemore Falls. They didn't match significant dates in Carnegie's life or the library's construction timeline. But Elena refused to give up on Thomas's basic insight that Morrison had used the Dewey Decimal System somehow. That evening, Elena was alone in the library, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the main reading room, surrounded by the 4 adventure books and a dozen different notebooks filled with their failed attempts to crack Morrison's code. The building was quiet except for the October wind rattling the windows and the occasional creak of old wood settling. She was frustrated and exhausted, but also more energized than she had felt in years. This was exactly the kind of intellectual puzzle that had drawn her to library science in the first place. The satisfaction of organizing information, of finding patterns and connections that others had missed. Elena picked up Tom Sawyer and flipped through it absently, not really looking for clues anymore, but just enjoying the feel of the old pages and the faint smell of vanilla that seemed to emanate from books of this era. That's when she noticed something she'd missed before. The book had been rebound at some point. The spine was slightly different from the original binding, and there were small differences in the end papers that suggested professional restoration work. More importantly, tucked between the back cover and the final end paper, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a thin piece of paper. Elena's hands trembled as she carefully extracted what turned out to be a small card, about the size of a library checkout slip. Written in faded ink, in the same handwriting they'd seen in Morrison's letters, were 4 lines. "Where knowledge meets imagination, seek the guardian of navigation. Count the steps as sailors do, the hidden door awaits for you." Elena stared at the card for a long moment, then grabbed her phone to call Thomas. "I found it," she said when he answered. "Morrison's first clue. It's a riddle." Thomas arrived within 20 minutes, still in his pajamas but wide awake with excitement. They sat at one of the reading tables under Elena's brightest battery-powered lantern and studied the riddle together. "Where knowledge meets imagination," Thomas read aloud. That could describe a library in general, but it might be referring to a specific section. Where would knowledge and imagination intersect most directly? "The children's section," Elena said immediately. "That's where educational books and fantasy stories would be shelved side by side." "And the guardian of navigation, that sounds like it could be describing a specific book or maybe a piece of furniture, something that helps people find their way." They headed down to the basement children's section, flashlights in hand. The area had been designed with young readers in mind. Lower shelves, bright colors that had faded over the decades, and child-sized tables and chairs. In one corner was a reading nook with built-in benches and a large window that would have provided natural light during the day. Elena and Thomas began systematically examining every book, shelf, and piece of furniture. The guardian of navigation clue led them to focus on atlases, geography books, and anything related to maps or travel. But after 2 hours of searching, they'd found nothing that seemed to match the riddle. It was Elena who finally made the connection, and it came from thinking about the riddle from a child's perspective rather than an adult's. Thomas, what if guardian of navigation doesn't refer to a book at all? What if it's describing a person? What do you mean? Elena walked over to the corner where a large painting hung on the wall, a portrait that Elena had noticed during her initial tour but hadn't paid much attention to. It showed a bearded man in 19th century naval uniform, standing on the deck of a ship with a compass in his hand and charts spread on a table beside him. A sea captain, Elena said. Someone whose job was literally to navigate ships and guard their safe passage. He'd be a guardian of navigation. Thomas examined the painting more closely. The nameplate at the bottom read, Captain Joshua Whitmore, 1847 to 1923, founder of Whitmore Falls. Elena, this is brilliant. The town was named after this man, and he was obviously some kind of maritime figure. But how does this connect to count the steps as sailors do? Elena thought about nautical terminology she'd encountered in adventure novels over the years. Sailors count distance in nautical miles, depth in fathoms, and paces, Thomas finished. When they're measuring distances on deck or on shore, sailors often count paces instead of feet. Elena stood directly in front of Captain Whitmore's portrait and began walking in a straight line, counting each step carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 27 paces, she reached the far wall of the children's section. There was nothing obviously special about this spot, just a section of shelving that held picture books about animals. Maybe I need to turn, Elena said. Sailors would navigate using compass directions. She turned 90 degrees to the right and continued counting. 28, 29, 30. At 35 paces, she was standing in front of a built-in bookshelf that seemed identical to all the others in the children's section. But as Elena ran her hands along the shelves, she noticed that one section felt different. The wood was the same, but the way it was joined was subtly different, as if this particular section had been built as a separate unit and then fitted into place. Thomas, come look at this. Together, they examined the bookshelf more carefully. Elena pulled out several picture books and discovered that the back panel of the middle shelf was loose. With gentle pressure, it slid aside to reveal a hidden compartment, just large enough to hold a single book. And there, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string that had somehow survived nearly a century, was Morrison's next clue. Elena's hands trembled as she carefully extracted what turned out to be a slim leather journal, bound in the same style as the books in the rare collection upstairs. The cover was unmarked, but when Elena opened it, the first page contained an inscription in Morrison's familiar handwriting. For the librarian who proves worthy of the trust placed in these walls. The map you seek lies not in what is written, but in what is remembered. Begin where stories end, and end where truth begins.
Below the inscription was a detailed drawing of the library's main reading room, but with markings and symbols that Elena had never seen before. Lines connected various architectural features. Numbers were written beside certain decorative elements, and in the center of the drawing was a symbol that looked like a compass rose overlaid with what might have been a key. Elena and Thomas looked at each other, both grinning despite their exhaustion. "We're really doing this," Elena said. "We're actually following a treasure map left by a Carnegie librarian over 100 years ago." "And we're good at it," Thomas replied. "Elena, I think Morrison chose his hiding places very carefully. He wanted clues that would only be found by someone who truly understood libraries, who respected books, and who had the patience to solve puzzles properly." Elena carefully closed the journal and tucked it under her arm. They'd made incredible progress, but she could sense that the real challenge was just beginning. Morrison's final clue suggested that everything they'd found so far was just preparation for the actual treasure hunt. As they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, Elena felt a profound sense of connection to the man who had built these puzzles for her to solve. Morrison had been a librarian, just like her. He'd understood the joy of organizing knowledge, the thrill of helping people find exactly what they were looking for, and the deep satisfaction of preserving important things for future generations. Now it was Elena's turn to prove herself worthy of the trust he'd placed in these walls. And somewhere in this building, waiting patiently as it had for over a century, was the treasure that Andrew Carnegie had considered important enough to hide in a secret chamber behind a library built specifically for that purpose. The discovery of Morrison's journal changed everything. Elena found herself waking up at 4 a.m, her mind racing with possibilities, unable to fall back asleep until she'd spent at least an hour studying the cryptic drawing by lamplight. The detailed sketch of the main reading room contained layers of information that seemed to reveal new secrets each time she examined it. Thomas arrived earlier each day, sometimes beating Elena to the library despite her sleeping there. He'd taken to bringing a thermos of coffee and a bag of pastries from the bakery in town, transforming their morning meetings into something that felt part research session, part treasure hunting expedition, and part breakfast club for obsessed academics. "I've been thinking about Morrison's final clue all night," Thomas said on Monday morning, spreading the journal open on the circulation desk. "Begin where stories end, and end where truth begins. What kind of organizational system would a librarian use to separate stories from truth?" Elena sipped her coffee and studied the drawing again. Fiction and nonfiction. In the Dewey Decimal System, literature is in the 800s, but everything else, history, science, biography, that's all considered factual material. So we'd begin in the fiction section and end somewhere in nonfiction? Maybe, but look at this compass rose symbol in the center of the drawing. See how it's overlaid with what looks like a key? I think Morrison is telling us that direction matters. We need to follow a specific path through the library. They spent the morning mapping out the symbols from Morrison's drawing onto the actual reading room. Each decorative element that he'd marked with a number or symbol had a real-world counterpart. Carved medallions in the wooden panels, specific light fixtures, even certain floor tiles that were laid in a slightly different pattern from the others. The breakthrough came when Elena realized that the numbers beside each symbol weren't random. They corresponded to specific books that should be shelved in those locations. But when they went looking for those books, most of them were missing from where they should have been according to the library's cataloging system. "They're not missing," Elena said suddenly. "They've been moved deliberately. Morrison relocated specific books to create a trail." It took them 3 days to locate all 12 books that Morrison had marked in his drawing. They were scattered throughout the library in seemingly random locations: an astronomy textbook shelved with cookbooks, a volume of Shakespeare sonnets hidden among automotive repair manuals, a biography of Benjamin Franklin tucked between romance novels from the 1980s. But when Elena and Thomas arranged the books in the order indicated by Morrison's numbers, they discovered something remarkable. The first letter of each book's title spelled out a message: "Carnegie Vault beneath Atlas Stand." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. There's actually a vault. Carnegie built an actual vault under this library. They raced to the reference section where a large wooden stand held the library's collection of atlases, massive, leather-bound volumes that showed the world as it had been understood in different eras. The stand itself was clearly original to the building, built from the same rich oak as the main shelving and designed to support the considerable weight of dozens of oversized books. Thomas and Elena began examining the stand from every angle, running their hands along the wood grain, checking for hidden latches or movable panels. The base was larger than necessary for simply holding books. It could have easily accommodated a hidden compartment or even concealed access to something below.
It was Elena who found the mechanism, and she discovered it completely by accident. While pulling out a 1925 Atlas of the Americas to examine its binding, she accidentally pressed too hard on a decorative rosette carved into the side of the stand. The rosette depressed slightly with a soft click, and suddenly a section of the stand's base swung inward on hidden hinges. "Thomas," Elena whispered, dropping to her knees beside the opening, "look at this."
Inside the base of the Atlas stand was a narrow staircase, clearly built during the library's original construction, but invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The steps descended into darkness, but Elena could see that they were made from the same stone as the library's foundation and appeared to be solid and well preserved. Thomas retrieved their strongest flashlights while Elena stared into the hidden passage, her mind reeling with the implications. Andrew Carnegie, one of America's most famous industrialists and philanthropists, had secretly funded the construction of a hidden vault beneath a small-town library in Vermont. And now, over a century later, she was about to become the first person to discover what he'd considered important enough to hide. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked, returning with their equipment and a coil of rope he'd found in the basement. Elena took a deep breath. "I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it until now." The staircase was narrow but well built, with stone steps that showed no signs of deterioration despite a century of neglect. Their flashlight beams revealed walls lined with the same limestone that had been used for the library's foundation, and Elena could see that considerable effort had gone into making this space permanent and secure. After descending about 15 feet, they reached a small landing with a heavy wooden door. The door was unlocked, but clearly hadn't been opened in decades. The hinges groaned in protest as Thomas pushed it inward. Beyond the door lay a chamber that took Elena's breath away. The vault was larger than she'd expected, roughly the size of a classroom, with a vaulted ceiling that rose 12 feet above their heads. The walls were lined with built-in shelves and cabinets, all crafted from the same oak as the library above. But what dominated the space was a large wooden table in the center, and spread across that table was the most beautiful map Elena had ever seen. The map was enormous, at least 6 feet by 4 feet, and appeared to be hand-drawn on parchment that had aged to a warm golden color. It showed what was clearly the northeastern United States, but with far more detail than any standard geographical map. Mountains, rivers, and coastlines were rendered with artistic precision, but the map was also covered with symbols, notations, and markings that suggested it served a very specific purpose. "Elena," Thomas whispered, moving closer to examine the map. "Look at these symbols. They're marking specific locations throughout New England and the maritime provinces. And these notations, they look like they're describing hiding places." Elena joined him at the table, her flashlight beam dancing across the intricate details of the ancient map. Along the edges were notes written in multiple hands in what appeared to be several different languages. Some were in English, but she could also make out what looked like French and possibly Spanish or Portuguese. "This isn't just a map," she said slowly. "It's a treasure map, a real treasure map, showing the locations of multiple hidden caches throughout the region." Thomas pulled out his phone and began taking careful photographs. "Elena, I think we're looking at something that predates the library by centuries. This map could be from the colonial period, maybe even earlier, and if these markings are accurate..." He trailed off as they both realized the implications. The map didn't just show one treasure location, it showed dozens. If even a fraction of the marked sites still contained what had been hidden there, they were looking at a discovery that would rewrite the history of treasure hunting in North America. But as Elena studied the map more carefully, she began to notice something that made her pulse quicken. One location was marked differently from all the others, with a red circle and multiple annotations in Morrison's familiar handwriting. And that location was less than 50 miles from where they were standing. "Thomas, look at this marking here.
Morrison added notes to this spot specifically, and according to his annotations, this site was confirmed as recently as 1922, the year before the library opened. Elena read Morrison's careful script aloud. Verified intact by personal reconnaissance, July 1922. Item secured per JM's final instructions. Access route confirmed passable. Estimated value exceeds expectations. Thomas adjusted his glasses and leaned in closer. JM. Those could be the initials of whoever created this map originally. Morrison was just the caretaker, but someone else was the source. As they continued exploring the vault, Elena and Thomas discovered that the map was just one piece of a much larger collection. The shelves contained leather-bound journals documenting expeditions and discoveries dating back to the 1600s, detailed surveys of locations marked on the map, and what appeared to be inventories of items hidden at various sites. One journal, bound in cracked red leather and written in fading brown ink, contained the most remarkable story of all. According to the dates, it had been written by someone named Jean-Baptiste Moreau between 1678 and 1994, and it told the story of a French privateer who had accumulated enormous wealth by raiding Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean. But Moreau hadn't been content to simply bury his treasure on some remote island like the pirates of legend. Instead, he'd established a network of carefully chosen hiding places throughout the regions where he intended to retire, locations that were accessible but secure, places where a man could retrieve his wealth gradually over time without attracting attention. Elena translated the French text slowly, her high school language skills stretched to their limit. The English colonies offer opportunities that the islands cannot. A man with wealth hidden in New England can live as a gentleman without questions about the source of his prosperity. But the key is distribution. Never place all trust in a single cache.
According to Moreau's journal, he'd hidden portions of his treasure at dozens of locations throughout what would eventually become Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and the maritime provinces of Canada. He'd created the map as a record for himself, but more importantly, he documented each site with enough detail that the treasure could be recovered even decades later. But why would this map end up in Carnegie's hands? Elena asked. And why would he go to such elaborate lengths to hide it? Thomas had been studying a different journal, one written in English and dated to the 1890s. I think I found the answer. This journal belongs to someone named James Mitchell, and he claims to be Moreau's descendant. According to this, the map was passed down through his family for over 2 centuries. Elena joined Thomas as he read from Mitchell's journal. Mr. Carnegie's interest in my ancestors' legacy is both surprising and welcome. The family has guarded these secrets for generations, but we lack the resources to pursue them properly. Mr. Carnegie's proposal offers a solution that serves both our interests. He will provide funding and expertise for recovering the most significant cache in exchange for a partnership that ensures the historical value of the discovery is preserved for future generations. So Carnegie and this Mitchell person were business partners, Elena said. Carnegie funded expeditions to recover Moreau's treasure, and in return, he got a share of the profits plus the historical artifacts. But something went wrong, Thomas added, flipping through more pages. Look at these later entries. Mitchell writes about increasing complications and parties who cannot be trusted. The last entry is from 1923, just before the library opened, and it says that Carnegie has decided to secure the primary documentation until such time as it can be safely pursued. Elena felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Carnegie didn't just fund this library to hide the map, he was protecting it. There were other people involved in this treasure-hunting partnership, and Carnegie didn't trust them anymore. So he created a safe place where the map could wait until someone trustworthy found it. Someone like a librarian, Thomas said with a grin. Someone who would appreciate the historical value and handle the discovery responsibly. Elena looked around the vault with its carefully preserved documents and the magnificent map spread out before them like an invitation to adventure. Morrison had been right in his letter. This was far more than just a treasure hunt.
It was a chance to uncover a lost chapter of American history, to solve mysteries that had been waiting for over 3 centuries. But as Elena studied Moreau's map and Morrison's annotations, she realized that finding the vault was just the beginning. The real treasure wasn't hidden under the library. It was waiting at coordinates that would require a journey, planning, and probably more courage than she'd ever needed as a small-town librarian. The map was calling to her, and Elena Rodriguez was about to discover that buying an abandoned library had been the first step in an adventure that would take her far beyond the quiet safety of organized books and catalog knowledge. Elena barely slept for 3 days after discovering the vault. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the magnitude of what she and Thomas had uncovered. During the day, she moved through her routine cataloging tasks like a sleepwalker, her mind constantly returning to the map spread out on that table 15 feet below the main floor. On Thursday morning, Thomas arrived to find Elena sitting in the vault at 6 a.m., wearing her pajamas and a heavy coat, with a mug of coffee growing cold beside Moreau's journal. "Elena, you can't keep coming down here alone," he said gently. "What if something happened? What if the entrance mechanism jammed?" Elena looked up from the journal, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion but bright with excitement. "Thomas, I've been reading Moreau's accounts of his expeditions. Do you realize what we're dealing with? This isn't just some pirate's buried chest. According to these inventories, we're talking about artifacts that could fill a museum." She pointed to a passage she'd been translating. "The Santiago cache alone contains 47 pieces of worked gold from Aztec sources, including ceremonial masks and jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship. The religious artifacts recovered from the Santa Isabella represent some of the finest ecclesiastical art of the period. These items are not merely valuable, they are irreplaceable examples of civilizations that the Spanish conquistadors sought to erase." Thomas sat down beside her, studying the careful inventories that Moreau had maintained. "Elena, I don't think you understand what you're saying. If these records are accurate, we're not just talking about treasure in the conventional sense. We're talking about lost cultural artifacts that belong in museums, not private collections." "Exactly," Elena said firmly. "That's what Carnegie understood, and that's why he hid the map instead of just going after the treasure himself. He knew that some discoveries are too important for personal gain." But even as she spoke those words, Elena felt the weight of practical reality pressing down on her. The monthly payment to the town was due in 10 days, and she had barely enough money to cover it. The heating system needed major repairs before winter set in properly, and she'd been putting off grocery shopping for 3 days because every dollar mattered. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was sitting on information that could lead to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history while struggling to afford basic necessities. Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. "Elena, we need to talk about what comes next. This discovery is bigger than the two of us can handle alone. We need legal advice, archaeological expertise, probably government involvement."
"I know," Elena said quietly. "But I'm terrified that if we bring in officials, they'll take everything away from us. The map, the library, maybe even my right to be involved in whatever happens next." "What if we approached this differently?" Thomas suggested. "What if we documented everything first, established our claim to the discovery, and then brought in the right kind of help? Academic institutions, museums, people who share our values about preserving history rather than exploiting it." Elena spent the next week researching legal precedents for treasure discoveries and archaeological finds. She reached out to professors at universities with strong history and archaeology programs, carefully describing her situation without revealing the full scope of what they'd found. The responses were enlightening and troubling. Most experts emphasized that any significant archaeological discovery would trigger complex legal processes involving multiple government agencies. The location of the treasure would determine which authorities had jurisdiction, but Elena could expect years of legal battles over ownership, excavation rights, and the ultimate disposition of any artifacts. But Elena also learned about successful partnerships between private discoverers and academic institutions, museums that had worked with individuals to ensure proper excavation and preservation while sharing both the costs and the credit for important discoveries. It was Dr. Sarah Chan, a maritime archaeology professor at Boston University who provided the perspective that Elena needed. Dr. Chan had worked on several high-profile shipwreck discoveries and understood both the academic and legal challenges involved. The key, Dr. Chan explained during a lengthy phone call, is establishing yourself as a responsible steward of the discovery rather than just a treasure hunter. If you can demonstrate that your primary interest is historical preservation and public education, you'll find much more support from the academic community and government agencies. Elena made a decision that surprised even Thomas. Instead of rushing to locate the treasure site marked on Moreau's map, she chose to spend her remaining savings on properly documenting and preserving the vault and its contents. She hired a professional photographer who specialized in historical documents to create high-resolution images of every page in Moreau's journals and every detail of the map. She contacted a paper conservation specialist who came to the library and spent 3 days stabilizing the most fragile documents using museum-quality techniques. Most importantly, Elena reached out to Dr. Mitchell Harrison, a professor of colonial American history at Dartmouth who had written extensively about French privateers in the North Atlantic. When Dr. Harrison saw the photographs Elena sent him, he canceled his classes for a week and drove to Whitmore Falls immediately. "Miss Rodriguez," said Dr. Harrison as he examined the vault for the first time, "you discovered what amounts to a time capsule from one of the most romanticized but least documented periods in American maritime history. These journals don't just contain treasure maps, they're primary source documents about colonial trade, Spanish colonial exploitation, and the complex relationships between European powers in the New World." Elena felt vindicated in her decision to prioritize preservation over immediate treasure hunting. Dr. Harrison helped her understand that the historical value of Moreau's documents might actually exceed the monetary value of whatever treasure remained at the marked locations. But Dr. Harrison also brought sobering news about the practical challenges ahead. "Elena, you need to understand that news of this discovery won't stay secret for long. The academic community is small, and word about significant finds travels fast. Once this becomes public knowledge, you're going to face pressure from multiple directions: treasure hunters, government agencies, media attention, and probably legal challenges." As if to prove his point, Elena received a phone call the next morning from someone who identified himself as Marcus Webb, representing what he called a private historical research foundation. "Miss Rodriguez, we understand you've made some interesting discoveries related to colonial-era maritime activities. We'd like to discuss a partnership that could be very beneficial for both parties." Elena had never mentioned her discovery to anyone outside her small circle of academic contacts, which meant that word was already spreading despite her efforts at discretion. When she asked Webb how he heard about her find, he became evasive. "Information about historical discoveries tends to circulate among people with shared interests. What's important is that we can offer you resources and expertise that you'll need to pursue this properly: legal protection, funding for excavation, connections with the right government agencies." Elena politely declined Webb's offer and immediately called Dr. Harrison to report the contact. His response was immediate and concerned. "Elena, that name, Marcus Webb, I've heard it before. He's associated with several questionable archaeological ventures, the kind of people who are more interested in profit than preservation. You need to be very careful about who you trust from this point forward." That evening, Elena sat alone in the vault, studying Moreau's map by lamplight and trying to process the rapid changes in her situation. 3 months ago, she'd been an unemployed librarian facing eviction from a tiny apartment. Now she was the guardian of a discovery that could rewrite chapters of American history, but she was also walking into a world she didn't understand, surrounded by people whose motivations she couldn't trust. The location that Morrison had marked as verified intact was calling to her. According to Moreau's notations and Morrison's confirmation, it contained what the privateer had described as the crown jewel of my American enterprise: artifacts and treasure that represented the culmination of his career.
But Elena was beginning to understand that finding the treasure would be the easy part. The real challenge would be protecting it, and herself, from all the people who would want to take it away from her once word of the discovery became public. Thomas found her there at midnight, hunched over the map, with pages of notes scattered around her. "Elena, you're driving yourself crazy with worry. We've done everything right so far. We've documented everything, we've involved legitimate academics, we've prioritized preservation over profit." "But what if that's not enough?" Elena asked. "What if the right thing to do is to turn everything over to a museum or university and walk away? What if I'm in over my head?" Thomas sat down beside her and studied the map that had consumed so much of their attention. "Do you remember what you told me when we first found Morrison's letters? You said that sometimes the greatest power isn't in the machine, it's in the person who dares to believe in it." Elena looked at him questioningly. "You believed in this library when everyone else saw a money pit. You believed in Morrison's clues when they seemed like random puzzles. You believed that this discovery was worth protecting and preserving properly. Maybe it's time to believe in yourself." Elena nodded slowly, feeling some of her anxiety transform into determination. She'd come too far to give up now, and she'd been too careful and responsible to lose everything to people who didn't share her values. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start planning an expedition to Morrison's confirmed site, but we do it right, with proper archaeological protocols, complete documentation, and legal protection in place." Thomas smiled. "Now that sounds like the Elena Rodriguez who bought an abandoned library and turned it into a treasure-hunting headquarters." As Elena climbed the narrow stairs back to the main floor, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She was no longer just a librarian trying to save an old building. She was the inheritor of a 3-century-old mystery, and whether she liked it or not, she was about to become the most important character in her own adventure story. 3 weeks later, Elena stood at the edge of a maple grove in northern Vermont, GPS coordinates matching perfectly with the location Morrison had marked on Moreau's map. The expedition team she'd assembled was small but professional. Dr. Harrison from Dartmouth, Dr. Chen from Boston University, 2 graduate archaeology students, and a documentary filmmaker who specialized in historical discoveries. Elena had spent her last $1,000 on proper excavation equipment and legal permits, but the investment had been worth it. The state of Vermont had granted them a limited archaeological research permit after reviewing the historical documentation from the vault. More importantly, the university partnerships she'd established meant that any discoveries would be properly preserved and studied rather than sold to private collectors. The site itself was unremarkable, a gentle hillside covered in old-growth maples with no obvious signs that anything had ever been buried there. But Moreau's instructions were precise, and Morrison's 1922 notes confirmed that the landmarks described in the 17th century journal were still accurate. "According to Moreau's directions," Dr. Harrison said, consulting the translation they'd prepared, "we're looking for the great stone that resembles a sleeping bear, positioned where the morning sun first touches the hill." Elena spotted it immediately. A massive granite boulder, weathered by centuries of Vermont weather into a shape that did indeed resemble a sleeping animal. Moreau's instructions called for measuring 30 paces due north from the bear's nose to find the burial site. The excavation took 2 days. Working in careful grid patterns and documenting every inch of soil they removed, the team slowly uncovered what appeared to be a stone-lined chamber about 6 feet square. Elena's heart raced as they exposed the first glimpse of worked stone and what looked like the corner of a chest. But it was Dr. Chen who made the discovery that would change everything. "Elena, come look at this," she called from the far corner of the excavation. "I don't think we're just dealing with treasure here." Dr. Chen had uncovered what appeared to be human remains, not just one skeleton, but parts of several, carefully arranged and accompanied by artifacts that told a story Elena hadn't expected. "These aren't the remains of Moreau's crew," Dr. Harrison said grimly as they exposed more of the burial.
Based on the artifacts and the way the bodies were positioned, these appear to be Native American remains. This isn't just a treasure cache, it's a burial site that was later used by Moreau. Elena felt her stomach drop. The legal and ethical implications were staggering. Native American burial sites were protected by federal law, and the discovery would trigger an entirely different set of legal processes involving tribal representatives and government agencies. But as they continued the excavation with even greater care and reverence, the story that emerged was more complex than simple grave robbing. Among Moreau's effects in the chamber, they found a leather journal that hadn't been mentioned in his other works. This final journal, written in the last years of his life, told a very different story than the swashbuckling privateer adventures documented in his earlier work. Elena translated the fading French text with growing amazement. The Abenaki elder who showed me this place did not do so for my gold, but because he believed the sacred objects his people had hidden here would be safer in my care than abandoned to the coming changes. He spoke of a time when his people would return to reclaim what was theirs, and asked only that I preserve everything until that day arrived.
The treasure that Moreau had hidden wasn't just Spanish gold and artifacts from his privateering days. The chamber contained sacred objects from the Abenaki people, ceremonial items, historical artifacts, and cultural treasures that had been entrusted to Moreau for safekeeping during a period when native communities were being displaced from their traditional lands. "Elena," Dr. Chen said softly, "I think Moreau was acting as a cultural preservationist, not just a treasure hoarder. This completely changes how we need to approach this discovery." Elena felt overwhelmed by the responsibility that had suddenly fallen on her shoulders. This wasn't just about solving a historical mystery or finding financial security for herself and the library. She was now the custodian of cultural artifacts that belonged to people whose descendants were still alive, still connected to their heritage, and had legal and moral claims to these objects. The next phase of the process took months, not weeks. Elena worked with federal agencies, tribal representatives from the Abenaki Nation, and academic institutions to ensure that every aspect of the discovery was handled with appropriate respect and legal compliance. The breakthrough came during a meeting with Joseph Bruchak, an Abenaki author and cultural historian who had been brought in to help interpret the significance of the artifacts they'd found. "Ms. Rodriguez," Bruchak said after reviewing our documentation, "what you've discovered isn't just a collection of objects. You've found a time capsule that was created during one of the most difficult periods in our people's history. The fact that these items were preserved and are now being returned to us it's like having ancestors we thought were lost forever come home." Elena realized that her role in this story wasn't as a treasure hunter or even as a historian. She was a bridge between past and present, helping to restore cultural heritage that had been hidden for over 3 centuries. The process of returning the native artifacts to the Abenaki Nation became a model for how such discoveries should be handled. Elena worked closely with tribal representatives to document each item, understand its cultural significance, and ensure that the repatriation process honored both legal requirements and cultural protocols. But the story wasn't over. The chamber had also contained Moreau's personal collection, Spanish colonial artifacts, maps, and documents that had significant historical value, but no cultural claims from living communities. After lengthy legal proceedings, Elena was recognized as the legitimate discoverer of these items, with ownership rights that she could exercise as she chose. The monetary value of Moreau's colonial artifacts was substantial, enough to secure the library's future, complete all necessary renovations, and establish an endowment that would ensure the building could operate as a public institution indefinitely. But Elena made a decision that surprised everyone who had been following her story.
Instead of selling the artifacts to private collectors or keeping them for personal gain, Elena donated them to create a new museum wing at the library. The Whitmore Falls Carnegie Library became the Morrison Rodriguez Center for Maritime History, housing permanent exhibits about colonial-era privateering, French exploration of North America, and the complex relationships between European settlers and Native American communities. The library that had once been scheduled for demolition became a destination for researchers, students, and visitors from around the world. Elena hired a small staff and established programs that brought together academic researchers, tribal historians, and community members to explore the connections between past and present. Thomas Bradford became the center's first curator, helping to design exhibits that told the complete story of Moreau's adventures, Morrison's preservation efforts, and the cultural significance of the discoveries. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Chen served on the center's academic advisory board, ensuring that ongoing research met the highest scholarly standards. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the Abenaki Nation, who honored Elena with a ceremony acknowledging her role in returning their ancestral artifacts. Joseph Bruchak presented her with a traditional gift and spoke words that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. Elena Rodriguez came to us as a stranger, but she honored our ancestors and our culture in a way that many of our own people thought we might never see again. She showed us that there are still people in this world who understand that some things are more valuable than money, and that the right thing to do is often the hardest thing to do. Elena stood in the main reading room of her library 1 year after making the discovery that had changed her life. The space looked much as it had when she'd first walked through those doors, but now it hummed with activity. Students worked at the reading tables, researchers examined documents in the climate-controlled archives, and visitors explored exhibits that told stories spanning 4 centuries. The financial pressures that had once kept her awake at night were gone. The library was financially secure, her staff was paid well, and Elena had even been able to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in library science and historical preservation. But more than the financial security, Elena had found her purpose. She was no longer just a librarian maintaining a collection of books. She was a guardian of stories, a bridge between past and future, and a living example of what could happen when someone chose to preserve history rather than exploit it. Dorothy Walsh, the retired teacher who had brought Elena casseroles during those early difficult weeks, stopped by one afternoon with a thermos of soup and a knowing smile. "You know," Dorothy said, "my grandmother always told me that this library was waiting for the right person to unlock its secrets. I think she would have been proud of what you've accomplished." Elena looked around the bustling main reading room, then down at the discreet entrance to the vault where Moreau's maps still lay preserved in climate-controlled storage.
"I think she was right," Elena replied. "But the secret wasn't treasure or hidden gold. The secret was that some places choose their guardians, and if you're brave enough to accept the responsibility, they'll show you possibilities you never imagined." Elena Rodriguez had bought an abandoned library to save her career, and found instead that she'd been chosen to save something far more important: the stories and heritage that connect us all to our shared human past. She'd discovered that the greatest treasures aren't always gold and jewels, but the knowledge, culture, and connections that make us who we are. And in a small town in Vermont, in a library that had been waiting over a century for the right person to find it, those treasures continued to be preserved, studied, and shared with anyone curious enough to walk through the doors and discover what wonders lie waiting on the shelves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen,
If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.